Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another online event brought to you by the Martin Center. My name is Margherita Movarelli, Head of Communications and Marketing at the Martin Center, and I will be with you for the next 45 minutes moderating this debate. Today we are going to discuss a number of issues connected to the political and economic repercussions of the coronavirus outbreak. First of all, we will analyze if and how this unprecedented health crisis is threatening the stability of the Eurozone. How can effective solidarity be shown between Eurozone members? And finally, we will try to make sense of the different positions emerged in the last EU Council on the Coronabonds, to see also what kind of compromise could be reached at European level. This is certainly a turning point for the European Union, and this crisis represents another important test for the EU. Today we have two excellent speakers that will help us analyze the situation. So let me briefly introduce them. My colleague Owen Dre, our senior economist, who has already published several contributions on the topic. And our second guest is Eckhard Wurzel, Honorary Professor of Economics at the University of Constance and the University of Göttingen. Also former head of bureau for the Euro area and the European Union at the OECD. Before we start, let me just encourage you, our online viewers, to ask your questions directly on our live streaming Facebook page. I will try to take as many questions as possible so that you get an answer from our speakers. So now let's start the discussion with you, Owen. You have published recently a research paper on a new European recovery program. The paper is available for download on our website. You clearly say that now it's time for the EU to do whatever it takes and for as long as is needed. What do you mean exactly?
Thank you, Margherita. It's good to see you today, and greetings from sunny Flanders. Basically, I think we're at the stage now where the realization is setting in that this crisis, both the economic crisis and the social restrictions, might be in place for a period significantly longer than maybe even we anticipated 2 to 3 weeks ago. And I think that while the fiscal economic support mechanisms will continue to be primarily national in nature, as we've seen all member states' governments support their businesses, their unemployed people, their small and medium-sized companies. I think what is needed now is that the scale of the crisis is so big. It's a global crisis, a pan-European crisis, that we do need some sort of formalized European response, European support mechanisms to help us recover from this crisis. I call for a new European recovery plan, and personally I think it should be kind of composed of four key principles. I think the first key principle is, when it comes to the euro, is whatever it takes, to borrow the phrase from Mario Draghi. I think a clear political statement is needed from Eurozone members, restating their commitment to the Eurozone area. I think the political arguments and disagreements over the past couple of weeks about Coronabonds and other issues, I think, are unfortunate. And I think they are, in a sense, maybe blinding us to the other bigger structural deficiencies within the Eurozone architecture that we must also tackle if we're to prevent contagion spreading from the financial markets to the Eurozone again. The second point is, when it comes to the economy in general, support must occur as long as is needed. Even when the public health crisis is, under control, we're still going to have a huge economic challenge in terms of restarting the economy, getting people back to work and getting companies functioning again. And we have to be realistic. this is likely going to extend the economic challenges at least well into 2021. So I think, again, there needs to be an explicit political commitment at both a national level and an EU level that the financial and fiscal support will be there for as long as is needed. The third point I would highlight is the point of, and this is probably the most topical point at the moment, given the recent media coverage about the issue of Coronabonds, is the issue of solidarity. For me, solidarity, it must be always, and it must be always there, no matter what the political or the economic disagreements. I think it's the underpinning of the entire European integration process. I think there are a huge array of mechanisms which could potentially be used, be it the European Stability Mechanism, jointly issued bonds, several other potential schemes. But I think, again, that the coverage of the Corona bond issue is kind of detracting from these really important debates that we need to be having. I think it's very important that a clear political signal is sent, which restates solidarity as a core concept of the European Union. And it's got to be easily understood by everybody, not just within the Brussels bubble or not just in academic circles. It's got to be, I would say, understood by all and available to all. And I think it's very, very important that this political signal is sent. The last point, and very quickly, is I would say we need to have a new discussion in Europe about the relationship between debt and growth. Because in the future, we're going to come out of this crisis with significantly higher levels of public debt. Fiscal support fiscal deficits will be high. Fiscal support will be needed for the foreseeable future till companies get back on their feet. And what we have to do is, in the short to medium term, is to understand that we can tackle this debt, and that the best mechanism for tackling this debt is higher growth rates. That will help to bring down the debt to GDP figures and help to drive the economy forward in the future. Margherita, I'll leave it there and I'll pass it back to you. And I'm happy to answer any further questions as we go through the debate.
Thank you, Owen. Professor, we have much food for thought. So do you have comments, and do you agree with the idea that the EU should take a strong role in this European recovery plan?
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you also that I can join you, which is really a pleasure to join you in this discussion. Yes, I think I would agree. Let me perhaps pick 2 or 3 points of what you was just saying. You mentioned solidarity. Well, I think the first thing that comes into mind then is, of course, the imminent health issue that we have, the testing of the people, having the right equipment to treat them, and so on, so on. It is a matter of solidarity indeed. However, it's not only a matter of solidarity. If we want to be able to open our borders again, have the flow of people, to have less problems in transporting goods across borders. So that is about the single market of the EU. Then, of course, a situation where everybody, every country in the European Union is capable and has the right equipment and has the capability, the capacity to test. That is an important thing for opening the borders. So over and above the solidarity, it is something which affects the single market. Of course, it is not only, it's also clear, and you mentioned it, it is not only the healthcare issue. If you look on what normally happens in a business cycle, quite often the situation is you have a certain growth path, an underlying growth path, then the economy is hit by a shock, demand goes down, and activity, GDP, is dropping below the productive potential of the economy. Now, what we are facing at the moment is a bit more complicated, because already at the outset, we had the productive potential of the economy itself hit that was hit by closing down businesses, by all the restrictions that we have on travel, etc., etc. So it affects the supply side of the economy, and not only the demand side of the economy. And it is clear, if we want to get back to, if we want to reestablish a well-functioning economy and economies in all our countries, that is also calling for help, right? It's not only the health issue, it is also support, you mentioned it, support for enterprises, support for labor and so on, just to keep also the productive capacity in our economies. So that is certainly also a case then for joint action of the EU, whatever that means concretely. We can discuss that. And maybe let me make the third point, because that can also be important. There is, of course, also financial market aspect associated with it, at least in two respects. First of all, if you want to finance all that, at least in the short run, governments can only do that by issuing debt. And that might actually not be that easy, because depending on what the level of indebtedness of a country already is, they might hit a limit where it's getting more and more difficult to finance their expenditures by issuing debt. So that's one thing. The other thing is, there could, of course, due to all those negative things that are going on in our economies, there could arise a situation where you get stress in the banking sector, for example, via non-performing loans. For example, and that is now a severe case, for example, potentially or perhaps of what we have been seeing during the financial crisis, where we got a negative feedback loop between the debt of the government on the one hand and the active side of the balance sheets of the banks on the other hand, and which brought us really into problems in the financial crisis that started in 2008, 2009. Now, clearly, we do not want to have that one. And then, of course, also then a matter of extending appropriate aid to our countries. And of course, it also has something to do with regulation. Let me perhaps stop here just to augment a little bit the points that Ewan were making. And back to you, Margarita.
Thank you, Professor. And let's open up for discussion. We are starting to receive some questions from our online viewers. Actually, one of these questions, which is a question by our policy director, Roland Freudenstein, has also to do with the multi-level that you mentioned. This is a very complicated issue, and it has to do with many, many aspects. And the geographical aspect is also part of it somehow, because we see a split in Europe between the positions of Southern European countries and Northern European countries. There is clearly a divide that emerged, especially on the issue of Coronabonds. So the question of Roland is, what could be a compromise between North and South on the issue of debt neutralization? So maybe, Owen, you can start, and then, Professor, you can also comment on that.
Thank you, Margarita. I think it's important to remember that although this is, this is very much an economic crisis, politics is very important. And I think what we've seen is that if we take the issue of Coronabonds, the issue just isn't about the Coronabonds per se, but it's a multitude of other issues that have grown up probably since the Greek debt crisis back in 2010, and the perceptions that have unfortunately been allowed to fester in the European Union. But I think Roland is correct in the sense that kind of in a political economy context, this issue now is taking on a much bigger significance for all sorts of reasons. partially, I think, and it's very important, and we should never forget this when we discuss the economics of it, is that this is a public health crisis. So it's actually affecting people's families, people's loved ones, people in hospital very seriously ill, and unfortunately, people passing away. So that gives the whole context of the discussions a very different context and a very different meaning, I think. And that's why it's become so emotionally charged. What I would answer to Roland is, I think a compromise is needed. And I think a compromise by its very nature requires people and member states to bend their long-standing priorities. I would personally argue that some immediate steps could be taken regarding the direct health costs that every member state are now facing. The additional billions of euros that member states must spend just to keep their health systems functioning, just to keep people being able to be treated in hospitals. And that if we could just set a clear political signal that this solidarity exists between all member states, that this money would be guaranteed by all member states, available to all member states, I think that would be a very important point, because really what we're talking about, almost as much as the mechanism itself, is the actual principle at this point. So that would be my view, Margarita.
Professor, what do you think? Do you agree with this approach that now it's really time to show solidarity and to try to find common solutions?
Yes, indeed. Perhaps to go a little bit initially below that step. I mean, it's not the case that there's no good solidarity going on at the moment, right? We have, for example, a natural disaster fund in the EU. We have joint procurement facilities in the EU. And in addressing that crisis, those instruments can play an important role. And if I understand the thing correctly, then initiatives on that front are already going on. So let's not entirely forget that. There is, by the European Commission, and in terms of coordination between governments, there is already something going on. Nevertheless, I agree. Even if we pop up the existing instruments, for example, the Natural Disaster Fund, that probably will not suffice. In particular, when we think about the thing that we have those possible negative we do have those negative spillover effects into the economy in the production potential that will need to be addressed in the future. So probably more needs to be done. And then, of course, that does raise the issue of what can we do, what is available. And as a matter of fact, I think that due to the crisis that we had starting in 2008, we are considerably better off than we were some 10 years or even less than 10 years ago. And so let me mention that because it is part of the discussion. We do have the ESM, right, the European Stability Mechanism. And we do have the possibility that that mechanism can raise funds, it does it as a matter of fact, on the capital market and aid countries in preserving their capacity to spend and in preserving their capacity to borrow for their spending. That is available. A problem is, at the moment, there would be too much conditionality associated with it. So I think, because you mentioned what can be a compromise between North and South, first of all, nice thing is that thing is there, that mechanism. Secondly, we would need to modify, and I suppose that's a contractual thing, we would need to modify the conditionality, and we would really need to establish a line now for this Corona situation. And we would not like to see, I suppose, a situation where the governments and the countries need to go through long memorandums of understanding just to get the funds. That needs to be faster. I'm talking about the immediate impact at the moment. So a compromise, for example, could be that the conditionality would be, well, if you get the funds now from that ESM, then please consolidate your budgets thereafter, that is, drive down your debt levels thereafter, which will be very important as a matter of fact. Also looking forward, also talking about growth in the future. So I think my point at the moment would be, take what happily is already available, that is, when it comes to big things, that is in the first place the ESM, and then adopt it or adapt it such that it can be readily used today and cut down the conditionalities to really something that is necessary at the moment and not more.
There are indeed two dimensions here that we have mentioned so far. The first dimension is the one which has to do with the instruments that we already have and how to use them wisely in this situation. And then on the other hand, we've mentioned also the fact that now extraordinary measures are also needed and expected by the EU citizens. Owen, you mentioned something else in your paper, and you mentioned the fact that every crisis is an opportunity. So also in this case, in this tragic situation, maybe this crisis could represent, in a way, an opportunity to reform the Eurozone and indeed to fix all the problematic aspects of the European projects. Every time there is a crisis, it happened during the financial crisis, it's happening now, are emerging. How do you see this possible? Because in the end, we should work on that in normal times, when it is possible, emotional approach, but then we end up always discussing this in extraordinary times when we need to really act very quickly. So what do you think can be done now?
Yeah, thanks, Margarita. I would agree with Eckhard. I think definitely we are in a much better situation than we were in 2008, 2009. But I think in a political context, certainly in a Brussels-based context, I think what happened was around 2014. Around 2014-15, the political appetite for further Eurozone reform kind of receded because at that time the recovery started to kick in. There was a final more lasting solution in Greece. And then in 2016, 2017, Europe began to be overwhelmed by the migration crisis. So the politicians' priorities shifted. But I think, it was Rahm Emanuel, former chief of staff to President Obama, who said, "You never want a serious crisis to go to waste." And I think that's a very, very important point. There are still many issues within the Eurozone which could be resolved, I feel, during this crisis. Eckhard mentioned the doom loop between banks and the debt of their respective national states. Issues about completing banking union, about putting in place the common deposit insurance scheme. Plenty of elements in terms of deepening the integration of European financial markets, what we know as capital markets union. All these issues are very important and are kind of stepping stones to building a really lasting and a much more robust monetary union. I would just finally highlight for anybody who likes economic history, I would point out the example of the Federal Reserve System in the United States. It was established in 1913, just before the onset of World War I. Within 15 years, it was confronted by the Great Depression of the late 1920s into the 1930s. And the reforms that were enacted in the 1930s, the 1930s Banking Acts, basically underpinned the functioning of the Federal Reserve until the financial crisis in 2008. So I think we all know that, politically it's very hard to reform at any point. But I think there is a window of opportunity when a crisis hits, that you can previously do things that you didn't think possible.
Am I on?
Let me take one first from Zigatut. Maybe, Professor, you can take this question. How possible is a more radical quantitative easing by the European Central Bank? Another interesting aspect when we speak about the instruments that we can use to address this crisis.
Well, first of all, it's not only about quantitative easing. If you look on the recent monetary policy decisions by the European Central Bank, that was more than just monetary easing. For example, they extended and lowered conditions for their liquidity provision in the banking sector, long-term refinancing operations and targeted long-term refinancing operations. They introduced also the possibility of buying other assets, commercial paper. So that is important, actually. It's important measures to keep the banking system afloat with liquidity, and we can consider that as kind of an insurance against possible problems then in the credit and in the banking system. As far as quantitative easing is concerned, that is a little bit a thin path here, because there is a limit for the European Central Bank in buying government bonds. The European Central Bank does not want, I suppose, and also the regulation says it must not do that. It does not have the right to finance government debt. There are certain restrictions. For example, it is not allowed to buy government debt on the primary market. It only can do it on the secondary market, and there are some more restrictions. So therefore, that is a bit limited. I suppose that the European Central Bank has done already quite a bit in what it could do, but the limitations that the ECB is facing here, this is exactly an additional argument that the governments actually needs to become active, because the support should come, the support for the labor market, the support for the enterprises, and so on, the spending that is necessary, that should not come from the European Central Bank. It should come from the governments, which would lead us back to a discussion: what is an appropriate instrument here? We mentioned, for example, the ESM. You mentioned perhaps the possibility of issuing joint bonds to finance spending on the European level. That is really where the music should be playing in the first instance, and not in shifting the ball, so to say, to the European Central Bank. I think that would be a mistake. And I think also that there's a limit to the effectiveness of monetary policy operations that the European Central Bank still can do.
So let me bring to you another question, which is very much connected to what you're saying now, because you were speaking about EU competencies. And we have a question from Bart van Erke, Director of the European Social Observatory. Does the COVID crisis provide a window of opportunity to extend the EU's competencies, including regarding public health and healthcare? Professor, maybe you want to say something also on that, because you were mentioning.
I think that the guiding principle, as a principle, so to say, should be the European Union should get active in fields where it can add value by being European Union. That is, by coordinating processes. If it can add value, it should do that. Yeah, I mentioned at the beginning, this issue with the healthcare, that you need a working healthcare system and a rapid response now on the healthcare side to that virus. You need testing, etc., etc. That is indeed something which would be in the domain of the European Union. Why? Because if those things, those healthcare issues, are addressed in a deficient way in one country, it's bad enough that that one country is suffering from it. But that's not all. The rest can also be suffering. If it is, for example, by closing the border. So yes, there are possibilities and there are fields where the European Union should become more active. You can think of quite a number of other fields over and above any healthcare issues. On the other hand, it should, of course, leave policies that can be better addressed on the national level or on the regional level. It should leave it there. Well, for example, when it comes to aid, when you look on the EU budget at the moment, almost 40% of the EU budget at the moment go to agriculture. That is an incredible amount. The justification for that one, in my view, is very, very low. It doesn't do very much good things in terms, for example, of environmental protection. So you really wonder what's going on there. Why is such a huge amount of EU resources spent to one particular sector? The largest part of this, almost 40%, is income support for agriculture. So what I'm saying is that is certainly a significant example, but it is an example that shows you over and above mobilizing additional resources, there is indeed quite a bit that the European Union can do in using its funds more effective. And precisely in the sense that the gentleman who asked the question was hinting at, in the fields where the European Union can create value added, not only the healthcare fields, also other fields.
It is actually what we've been discussing also in several research papers on the future of Europe, how to strike a good balance between what the EU should do and what the member states should do. As we have other questions, let me take another one now, when maybe you can take this one, because you were speaking about the reform of the Eurozone, and you were also speaking of possible compromise to be seen in a model that would give more control and responsibility back to the member states. The question is from our executive director, Tommy Hutanen. How would such a model work in the current situation, and why profound reform of the Eurozone is needed? Owen.
Thank you, Margherita. I think there were some interesting trends happening even before the crisis struck in Brussels in particular. I think there was an awareness and I think an acceptance at all levels, including within DG ECFIN, that Europe's fiscal rules were too complicated, too difficult to fully understand, and practically impossible to enforce. And I think that trend for a kind of a simplified, more rational kind of Eurozone is very important in kind of the work that we do in proposing Eurozone reform. What I think is very interesting is that if you look at the United States model, also have a no bailout rule, which is including in the European treaties. It's been ignored in the European treaties, probably for good reason at the height of the Eurozone crisis. But no state since the time of Alexander Hamilton in the late 18th century has received a bailout from the federal US government in Washington. And that's because the structure of the monetary union is fundamentally different. The structure of the monetary union puts responsibility, fiscal responsibility, back to where the money is spent. And in the United States, that's at the state level. But of course, what you have in the United States is you have a much more developed fiscal union, where Washington can provide support and assistance to states in need who are going through an economic downturn, who are going through, some sort of natural disaster. But the point we would also that I would make in terms of Eurozone reform is this: if we continue the situation where countries who are experiencing economic difficulties, or countries that are experiencing very difficult natural catastrophes like Italy or Spain at the moment, if we continue to have a situation where they are constantly having to fight and to beg Brussels for, some sort of derogation or, more fiscal support, then I think we're building up a lot of political problems, because I think eventually this will fuel the flames of populism, as it is doing already in countries like Italy. And I think we need to be very important. We need a monetary union that is, as Eckhart said, the European Union has to add value. It has to make us stronger. It can't be seen as some sort of debtor's prison where, the strong, the fiscally strong, tell the fiscally weak what to do. I think that's a disaster. I'll put it like this. When Volkswagen and BMW and Airbus go to the United States to build companies, they don't build companies they don't build factories in California or New York. They build companies in places like Mississippi and Georgia and Alabama. And that's because there is a state-level competition. There's a state-level competition for investment. There's a state-level competition between the different economies. But there is not this expectation that they will be bailed out. Now, obviously, in the current situation, it's very, very difficult because this is a public health crisis, and we have the legacy of the past decade of the Greek debt crisis. But what I would argue, and Professor Charles Wyplas has provided a paper for us in the Martin Centre on this, is that we really need to think. We really need to think of a new approach in terms of a monetary union in Europe, and we need to think of a more decentralized United States model if we're really to be serious about the Eurozone not going the way of the Scandinavian monetary union or the Latin monetary union or other monetary unions which have failed in history. Thank you.
Oh, and there is another question from Panos Kakoloris, again on the issue of solidarity. So maybe you want to briefly comment on this one too, and then I would ask also Professor to comment. Solidarity in the form of support about health needs will not prove enough. So would be not enough to show solidarity in the form of supporting health needs. Existing ESM seems rather small in comparison to the situation. And here is the question: do you think that a not sufficient EU response will cause an existential crisis to the Union? This is quite a tough question. Oh, well, maybe you want to take it, and then Professor, I would also.
I'll take that question, and I think I will also answer that question maybe as a historian and not as an economist, because I think the answer to that question is yes, and I think the problem is that when a once in a generation or a once in a century crisis hits, like the coronavirus pandemic has hit the world, you really have one chance to set the tone, to set out the priorities, your initial priorities about what's important. All the details can follow later. And I think at the start, because of the disagreements in the Eurozone, there is the perception now that, even in the midst of this crisis, that solidarity was not the overriding principle. And as I say, solidarity isn't just about financial solidarity. It's about political solidarity, and it's about sending a political message and sending a political tone. And I think, I would just answer yes to that question.
Pastor, what would you answer?
I think I would agree. It's quite a bit now. As far as the fiscal rules are concerned, indeed, Ewan said it is complicated and so on. If you look on those rules, one by one, it's quite a bit of quite many rules actually. They all make sense, but for certain reasons, they really have their deficiencies. And one thing is really that it is too complex. If it is complex, that means also the ownership, the identification in the different countries with those rules cannot really come about. And if that identification cannot come about, it means that the support from the public, for example, for keeping budgets, for keeping households, public households in order, that support is also not as big as it could be. So something needs to be done here. But, and that leads us a little bit to the next question as well, not everything is a matter of rules. It's not not everything is a matter of you can do this, you are forbidden to do that, etc., etc. That can actually be a problem. We need to come to a situation where markets and incentives work as good as possible in the direction that we want, in the direction, for example, of securing the stability of our economies, of supporting medium and long-term growth in our economies. And if you go through it, you can find quite a bit of things that can be improved in the European Union to make that work better. To mention one amongst many, there is still a preference in bank regulation for government debt, which is privileged over other assets. That is a situation which is just not acceptable. Something needs to be done in that respect, and it impedes the proper functioning, or at least it can impede the proper functioning of the capital market, the allocation of resources over the capital market. In fact, it also can even lead to another crisis. And you can find other things. So the last point, although we are in the crisis, first of all, yes, indeed, we need to act in a solidaric way and with big funds if necessary. It is, as you, in my view, correctly said, it is a matter of solidarity. It is also a matter of economics. But let us not forget, even in a crisis mode, that we need to preserve and develop an institutional structure in the European Union which supports a growth-oriented model, both in terms of policies, but also in terms of the ability of the markets to generate that growth, because ultimately that is what it is about, right? It's the economies which generate employment growth, etc., etc. And that is quite a bit, actually, a whole network, not just one or 2 points, which of things which are relevant there and which are to be considered there. And it would be great indeed if that crisis could then give an impetus to reconsidering quite a number of things where action actually would need to be required.
Thank you. This is a very complex and important topic, so we could continue for hours, but unfortunately we run out of time. So let me thank you for being with us, and our online viewers as well for following us very actively in this debate. I know that there are other questions, but unfortunately, as I said, we run out of time. But we will keep on working on this topic, and I encourage you all to continue the discussion with us on our social media platforms. So stay home, stay informed, and keep following us. Thank you.